What happens when an army once considered the weakest in Africa dares to challenge the world order? The boots clatter, the tanks appear not to conquer, but to declare, "We no longer kneel." The West talks about stability, but in the fields, villagers chant a single word, honor. And the name that turns uniforms into symbols, training grounds into schools of freedom, is Ibrahim Traoré. Since assuming power in 2022, Captain Ibrahim Traoré has sought to remake Burkina Faso in the spirit of Sankara, rejecting France, embracing self-reliance, and turning factories and farms into engines of rebirth. A Washington Post feature summarized, noting he has reshaped Burkina Faso by rejecting Western influence and launching self-reliance and agricultural initiatives to revive national pride and economic independence. Across Ouagadougou, murals and new streets bear the name of Thomas Sankara, symbols Traoré wields as both torch and mirror for a revolution yet unfinished. The day began with silence. No markets, no traffic, no clatter of metal in the workshops of Ouagadougou. By dawn, the city was already awake, waiting. From balconies and dusty crossroads, families gathered, their eyes fixed on the boulevard. They had heard whispers all week that President Ibrahim Traoré would reveal something the nation had never seen before. At first, it was only the sound, the low growl of engines, steady, deliberate. Then, a formation of armored carriers appeared, painted not with foreign insignia, but with the green and red of Burkina Faso. Each vehicle bore a crest, freshly stenciled, "Sovereignty or nothing." The crowd gasped. For decades, whenever Burkinabe soldiers marched, their uniforms carried the scent of dependency equipment leased, doctrines borrowed, strategies imported. But this was different. These were weapons not paraded in service to a distant power, but carried as a declaration of survival. Traoré stood on a raised platform, not behind bulletproof glass, but before his people. His hand did not rise in salute to generals, but in greeting to farmers, miners, students, those who had sacrificed most in the war against terror. His words were few, yet they pierced through the roar of machinery. "We are no one's client state. We are a free people, and this is the proof you demanded." Behind him, a phalanx of soldiers stepped forward, their boots striking the ground like a drumbeat. They were young, many scarcely older than the students in the crowd, yet their discipline was unmistakable. Each bore not just a rifle, but the weight of a promise, that Burkina Faso would not fall to mercenaries, to hunger, or to fear. Elders whispered that they had never seen such order, such pride. Mothers clutched their children closer, telling them to remember this day. And across the digital plains of Africa, phones streamed the spectacle live, the images ricocheting from Bamako to Kinshasa, from Johannesburg to New York. For once, Africa was not portrayed as fractured or desperate. It was armored, united, and standing tall. As the parade pressed on, something unusual caught the crowd's attention. The soldiers were not only displaying rifles and armored carriers, they carried tools, shovels, welding kits, medical bags. It was a military march, yes, but also a procession of builders, healers, and protectors. One column stopped in front of the presidential stand. Instead of saluting, they unfolded a massive steel bridge segment, demonstrating how quickly it could be assembled to reconnect villages cut off by floods and sabotage. Another unit marched with portable water pumps, engineered in collaboration with Burkinabe students. Each machine was paraded as if it were a weapon, because in a country starved of infrastructure, it was a weapon. President Ibrahim Traoré's message was unmistakable. This was not a military built for spectacle alone. It was a force designed to rebuild, to defend, and to serve. The applause swelled, not out of fear, but pride. Foreign reporters scribbled in their notebooks, stunned. For years, their headlines painted Burkina Faso as a fragile state hanging by a thread. Yet here was a different image, a young leader redefining what strength looked like. Near the end of the parade, a unit of women soldiers emerged, their rifles gleaming under the harsh Sahel sun. They carried themselves with the unshakable calm of those who had fought, lost comrades, and returned still standing. Children cheered as if they were watching their older sisters carry the entire nation on their shoulders. Then came the silence. A vast black flag was unfurled, not a flag of mourning, but one embroidered with gold letters, "Africa will not bow." The crowd erupted. Elderly men raised their fists, young boys climbed onto shoulders, women sang old revolutionary songs once whispered in fear, now shouted with defiance. For the world, it was a shock. For Burkina Faso, it was a turning point. Traoré had transformed the military parade, once a hollow ceremony, into a living manifesto of sovereignty. And somewhere in the crowd, a farmer turned to his son and said, "Remember this. Today, your president has armed us with dignity." Night fell, but the echoes of the parade lingered in Ouagadougou like thunder, trapped in stone. The city did not sleep. Radios crackled in roadside cafes, replaying the speech of Ibrahim Traoré. In the villages, elders repeated his words to children around lantern fires. And across the borders, the world took notice. In Paris, in Washington, in Brussels, intelligence briefings carried one phrase over and over: Burkina Faso is no longer predictable. What once had been dismissed as a small, landlocked nation now appeared to be shaping the political currents of an entire continent. That evening, as generals and ministers gathered in the presidential compound, Traoré leaned over a wooden map of Burkina Faso, carved by local artisans. It was marked not with borders, but with rivers, schools, farms, and conflict zones. His voice was calm, steady. "Our enemies expect us to show them tanks. Let them see our farmers. They expect to see foreign bases. Let them see villages defended by their own sons and daughters. They expect weakness. Let them see a nation united." A hush fell over the room. Even seasoned commanders felt something shift. This was not strategy in the conventional sense. This was a philosophy of resistance. Outside the compound, thousands of young volunteers gathered, demanding to enlist. They did not ask for salaries, they asked for training. They asked for a place in history. Many carried nothing but farming tools, yet they stood shoulder to shoulder, ready to serve. Western advisors watching through satellite feeds called it dangerous fanaticism. But for Burkinabe mothers who had buried sons, lost to mercenary raids, it was hope at last. And in that moment, Ibrahim Traoré realized something greater. He was no longer just commanding soldiers, he was commanding belief. Within days, the footage of Burkina Faso's military display spread across global networks. In Africa, it was replayed with admiration. In Europe and America, it was replayed with concern. Analysts debated in tense tones. Was this the rise of a new power bloc, or merely the posturing of a young leader? Yet inside Burkina Faso, the mood was not speculation, it was conviction. Markets bustled again, but this time with conversations about sovereignty. Farmers spoke of forming cooperatives, inspired by the sight of soldiers carrying shovels. University students debated not only history, but the future. Could Burkina Faso become the torchbearer for African self-determination? But pressure was building. Western envoys demanded clarification. Is Traoré aligning with Moscow? With Beijing? They pressed in private meetings. The young captain gave the same response each time. I align with Burkina Faso. This answer unsettled them more than any alliance could. A leader who belonged not to the West nor the East, but to his own people, that was the most dangerous figure of all. Meanwhile, across Africa, whispers grew louder. From Ghana to Niger, from Mali to Chad, young officers studied the Ouagadougou Doctrine, as journalists had begun to call it, a military not built only for war, but for development, dignity, and defense of sovereignty. On the ground, ordinary Burkinabe felt the shift most clearly. A mother in Kaya said, "For the first time, I send my son to train with soldiers not as cannon fodder, but as a builder." A miner in Houndé declared, "We dig not just for gold, but for independence. At the UN, diplomats traded cautious words. But one African delegate, speaking off record, said what many were thinking. If Traoré succeeds, Africa will never be the same. And so, beneath the hum of city lights and the watchful eye of satellites, the stage was set. Burkina Faso was no longer just a country on the map. It had become a question the world could no longer ignore. What happens when Africa dares to define itself? The morning after the parade, reports arrived of strange movements along Burkina Faso's northern border. Convoys with no flags, shadows slipping through villages, foreign mercenaries disguised as traders, carrying weapons hidden beneath sacks of grain. President Ibrahim Traoré received the intelligence without alarm. He knew this would come. Every display of strength attracts a countermeasure. As he stood at the map table once again, the weight of centuries pressed on him. Empires had risen and fallen here, yet the Sahel remained a battlefield of resource and resistance. "Do not panic," he told his generals. "That is what they want. They will test us, not with armies, but with fear. We must answer differently." And so the response was not a rush of tanks or bombers. It was subtler, almost invisible. Traoré ordered local militias to merge with village councils. He instructed soldiers to fight not only with rifles, but with listening, to sit in village squares, share meals, and understand what families needed most. The mercenaries expected hostility. Instead, they found communities already fortified by trust. They found schools guarded by teachers, wells protected by mothers, markets watched by farmers. When infiltration failed, they turned to violence, small raids meant to terrify. But this time, the people fought back, not just with weapons, but with unity. A farmer in Jibo raised the alarm with a drum, summoning neighbors who had trained with volunteer brigades. A group of teenage girls in Kaya relayed warnings through coded songs, carrying messages faster than radios could. What the mercenaries discovered was not an army they could intimidate, but a nation too tightly woven to unravel. From his headquarters, Traoré listened as reports flowed in. Villages holding their ground, militias responding with precision, soldiers standing shoulder to shoulder with civilians. He smiled, not in triumph, but in recognition. "This," he whispered, "is the Burkina Faso they said could not exist." News of the failed infiltration spread faster than the mercenaries themselves. By the time foreign backers received word of their collapse, Africa was already celebrating. Radio hosts in Bamako called it the night the Sahel found its backbone. In Dakar, newspapers published front-page headlines declaring, "Burkina Faso does not kneel." But while Africa cheered, the corridors of Western power trembled. Intelligence agencies scrambled to revise their assessments. A confidential memo leaked to the press admitted, "Traoré's strategy cannot be neutralized through conventional means. His authority derives not from weapons, but from the unity of his people." That revelation was the true danger. A government that stood because its citizens believed, not because it was propped up by aid or foreign bases, could not be bribed or threatened into compliance. Inside Burkina Faso, the victory reshaped the nation's spirit. In the town of Bobo Dioulasso, musicians composed new anthems, blending drums with electric guitars, their lyrics praising both the farmers and the fighters. In Wahiguya, school children drew pictures of soldiers carrying both books and rifles, symbols of a new kind of heroism. Ibrahim Traoré, however, refused to declare it a triumph. In a televised address, his tone was sober. "Do not mistake this for the end of struggle. They will come again with lies, with money, with promises. But we have already won something greater, the knowledge that we can defend ourselves together." And the camera lingered on his face, not polished, not rehearsed, but resolute. For many watching, it was not just a speech, it was a covenant. Elders in remote villages said quietly, "This is what we prayed Sankara would live to finish." Young Africans in Lagos, Nairobi, and Addis Ababa posted the clips with a single caption, "Africa Rising." And somewhere in Washington, an analyst admitted on record what no one else dared. If Ibrahim Traoré survives this decade, the entire balance of African news will tilt. He is rewriting the script. It began with a rumor, a leaked document circulating in African capitals. At first, many dismissed it as fabrication, but as confirmations trickled in, the world gasped. A secret summit had taken place in Ouagadougou, hosted by President Ibrahim Traoré himself. Unlike the hollow conferences staged in Western hotels, this meeting was different. Leaders from Mali, Niger, Guinea, and even distant Tanzania had gathered in a dimly lit hall once used as a colonial administrative office. The symbolism was not lost. The very building where foreign rulers once dictated African futures now echoed with African voices deciding their own. The document revealed the purpose: the drafting of a mutual defense pact not under NATO, not under the UN, but under Africa's own command. It would pool resources, coordinate intelligence, and establish that an attack on one sovereign African state would be treated as an attack on all. The shockwaves were immediate. News outlets called it a seismic shift in African news. Western officials scrambled for statements warning of destabilizing consequences, but across the continent, ordinary people whispered a different phrase: "At last, we are not alone." The twist was clear. Traoré had not simply strengthened Burkina Faso. He had ignited the possibility of an African military alliance, something colonial powers had worked tirelessly to prevent for generations. And as the leaks spread, one truth became undeniable. The captain of a small Sahelian nation was now steering the compass of an entire continent. The leak was explosive enough, but what followed turned whispers into thunder. Days later, Ibrahim Traoré appeared on national television, standing before the flags of not one, but 7 African nations. The rumors were true. The pact was no fantasy. It was real, and it was binding. His words were steady, deliberate. We were told Africa could never defend itself without permission. We reject that lie. From this day, we declare that sovereignty is not negotiable. The announcement electrified the continent. Across Africa news outlets, headlines ran with one refrain: a new dawn. Markets buzzed with cautious optimism. Universities held impromptu debates. Even in countries not part of the alliance, young people filled the streets chanting Traoré's name, waving homemade banners reading, "Unity is our shield." But the consequences abroad were swift. Western governments issued urgent communiques. Stock markets jolted as investors speculated on the security of African resources once treated as open spoils. Analysts warned of a tectonic shift in the global order. Yet in Ouagadougou, the mood was not defiant, but determined. Traoré did not gloat. Instead, he framed the pact as necessity. We are not closing doors to the world. We are opening the door to our dignity. For his supporters, this was more than strategy. It was prophecy fulfilled, a resurrection of dreams long buried under colonial rubble. For his opponents, it was confirmation of their deepest fear, that the future of Africa would no longer be written in foreign capitals, but in its own soil. And so, the young captain of Burkina Faso, once underestimated, now stood as the unlikely architect of a continental shield. Dawn rose over Ouagadougou, painting the city gold. The streets were quieter now, but beneath the calm lay a strength no enemy could shatter. Markets opened, schools filled, and farmers bent once more over the soil, yet everything felt changed. A nation once spoken of only in crisis had become a beacon. Under President Ibrahim Traoré, Burkina Faso stood not as a pawn on someone else's chessboard, but as a people in command of their destiny. No longer merely defending borders, they were cultivating a new Africa, one of educated children, thriving villages, and a military that built as fiercely as it fought. In his final words to the nation, Traoré spoke plainly. "We did not ask for permission to be free, we stood up to win it." Across the continent, those words rippled like a drumbeat. From the Sahara to the Cape, from the savannas to the coast, Africans repeated them in homes, classrooms, and streets. For the first time in generations, hope felt heavier than fear. If the spirit of Ibrahim Traoré touches your heart, share this story. Subscribe to the channel to continue the journey of an Africa that no longer bows its head. God bless Africa.